Imagine for a moment that you're walking down the street wearing your finest suit made of neon lights. Everyone's staring, not because you're stylish, but because you're quite literally glowing. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, trust me, that's just scratching the surface of the bizarre fashion trends people have willingly embraced throughout history. Fashion has always been a form of self-expression. Sometimes, though, self-expression takes a very odd turn. From absurdly uncomfortable garments to head-scratching accessories, history is filled with fashion trends that, in hindsight, make you wonder, what were they thinking? Today, we'll journey through some of the dumbest fashion trends in history. Those times when people traded common sense for the sake of being on trend. Number 1. Powdered wigs, 18th century. Worn by European aristocrats, powdered wigs were not only expensive, but also ridiculously impractical. Made from horse or goat hair, these wigs required regular powdering to maintain their white color and volume. Initially adopted to cover up baldness caused by syphilis, they became a symbol of high status, because nothing says elite like a head full of itchy, artificial hair that doubles as a flower dusting. Over time, these wigs grew so large and ornate that they became more about vanity than practicality. Some even had entire scenes, like tiny ships, crafted into the wigs. Number 2. Krinolin Skirts, 19th century. Krinolin skirts were all the rage in the 1800s, but there's nothing practical about wearing a metal cage under your dress. These skirts expanded women's dresses to an absurd width, making it difficult to fit through doorways or even sit down comfortably. Worse yet, these skirts were highly flammable, and there are tragic stories of women being caught in deadly fires because of their crinolins. In fact, they were so dangerous that doctors started warning women against wearing them. Yet the trend persisted for decades. Number 3. Foot binding, 10th century China. Considered a mark of beauty in ancient China, foot binding involved breaking young girls' feet and tightly wrapping them to keep them small. While the trend produced the desired dainty lotus feet, it caused lifelong pain, immobility, and deformity. Despite the extreme suffering, foot binding persisted for centuries because small feet were associated with high social status. This painful tradition highlights just how far people are willing to go for an idealized version of beauty. Number 4. Hobble skirts, 1910s. Designed by French fashion designer Paul Poiret, hobble skirts were ankle-length, tight-fitting skirts that severely restricted women's movement. The skirts were so narrow that women could only take tiny steps, hence the term hobble. Imagine trying to run to catch the bus, or do anything really, while wearing one. Women in the early 20th century embraced these impractical skirts as a mark of elegance. But in reality, it was like wearing a fashion prison on your legs. Number 5. Macaroni fashion, 18th century England. The term macaroni didn't always refer to pasta. In 18th century England, the Macaroni Club was a group of men known for their extreme and exaggerated fashion. They wore oversized wigs with tiny hats perched on top and carried fancy canes, all to show off their continental travels. But instead of looking sophisticated, they ended up looking like clowns, a lesson in how not to overdo a trend. The macaronis became so ridiculous that they were satirized in newspapers and plays, leaving their fashion choices immortalized in humor. Number 6. Cod pieces, 15th to 16th century Europe. Back in the day, men wore cod pieces, exaggerated pouches attached to the front of their trousers, to, well, highlight their manhood. These accessories grew larger and more ornate over time, becoming both a fashion statement and an early form of, let's say, male enhancement. It's a good thing this trend didn't last, or we'd be seeing some very strange red carpet looks today. Believe it or not, some cod pieces were so decorated that they even had jewels and embroidery. Number 7. Bustle dresses, 19th century. While crinoline skirts expanded outwards, bustle dresses expanded backward. Women in the 1800s wore wire or padded bustles under their skirts to create the illusion of an exaggerated rear end. It was uncomfortable and made sitting nearly impossible, but apparently it was worth it to look like you were permanently mid-squat. This trend was all about status, as having a large rear signaled wealth and fertility, despite its impracticality. Number 8. Extreme shoulder pads, 1980s. In the 1980s, power dressing meant one thing: enormous shoulder pads. Women padded their blazers to absurd proportions, making their shoulders look wider than a linebacker's. The idea was to project strength and authority in the workplace, but in reality, everyone just looked like they were ready for a game of tackle football. The trend was largely influenced by the growing role of women in corporate spaces, but looking back, it's hard to take those shoulders seriously. Number 9. Rough collars, 16th century. Elizabethan fashion saw the rise of the ruff, an elaborate pleated collar that resembled a giant doily wrapped around the neck. While ruffs were worn to signify wealth and status, they were stiff, uncomfortable, and made it difficult to eat, turn your head, or, do anything practical. Some ruffs grew to be so large that they made everyday life almost impossible. Definitely not the accessory of choice for a casual lunch. Number 10. Jabo, 18th century. Worn by men and women, jabots were frilly lace neck pieces that cascaded down the chest. Think of it as an oversized bib, but instead of for eating, it was for making a fashion statement. These delicate pieces required constant maintenance and cleaning. One small spill and you were out of luck. Today, jabots are mostly seen as historical artifacts, but at the time, they were considered an essential part of high society attire. Number 11. Low-slung jeans, 2000s. The early 2000s was a funny time where jeans sat so low on the hips that you were one wrong move away from showing your entire backside. Popularized by celebrities and pop stars, this trend gave rise to whale tails and plumber's cracks everywhere. It's safe to say we're all glad this one has faded into the past, though some fashion circles are attempting to bring them back. Let's hope they don't succeed. Number 12. Corsets, 16th to 19th century. Corsets were designed to give women a tiny waist, but the price of beauty was literal pain. These tightly laced garments restricted breathing, caused fainting, and even deformed rib cages over time. Women may have looked dainty and delicate, but underneath they were suffering for fashion in a way that's hard to fathom today. The corset is a reminder of how beauty standards can lead to unnecessary suffering in the name of style. Number 13. Sagging pants, 1990s. A hallmark of 90s hip-hop culture, sagging pants had guys walking around with their jeans hanging halfway down their thighs. Not only did it make walking difficult, but it was also just plain impractical. The origin of this trend is often linked to prison uniforms, where belts were not allowed, and somehow it became mainstream fashion. Despite frequent criticisms, sagging pants still make occasional appearances on the streets today. Number 14. Lotus slippers, ancient China. Worn by women with bound feet, Lotus slippers were tiny shoes designed to fit the deformed feet of those who had undergone foot binding. These shoes were only a few inches long and represented an ideal of beauty. But much like the practice of foot binding itself, they were a symbol of immense suffering. It's hard to believe that something so physically limiting was once seen as fashionable. Number 15. Baggy Jinko jeans, 1990s. Remember Jinko jeans? These wide-leg monstrosities were so big you could probably fit two people in one leg. While they were a staple of 90s street fashion, looking back, it's clear that they were more of a fabric waste than a fashion statement. These oversized jeans had no shape and often dragged on the ground, making them both impractical and unflattering. Number 16. Neck rings, various African and Asian cultures. Neck elongation using brass rings is a cultural practice in some parts of Africa and Asia. While it has cultural significance, it can cause long-term damage to the spine and muscles. The rings push the collarbone down, creating the illusion of a longer neck, but the practice is not without serious health risks. fashion in this case came at a significant physical cost. Number 17. Lead-based makeup, 16th century England. Without a doubt, the most dangerous fashion trend in history was the use of lead-based makeup in the Elizabethan era. Women would apply a thick layer of white lead to achieve a pale, ghostly complexion, considered the height of beauty at the time. Unfortunately, the makeup was highly toxic, causing skin damage, hair loss, and even death over time. The quest for beauty came at a deadly cost, making this trend not only dumb, but also incredibly dangerous. Queen Elizabeth I herself used this makeup, and it's said to have contributed to her declining health. If there's one thing to take away from this, it's that fashion is cyclical, and what's considered ridiculous today might just come back into style tomorrow. Fashion often reflects the values and aspirations of its time, even if those values lead to some truly bizarre choices. Now it's your turn. What's your favorite ridiculous fashion trend? Drop it in the comments below, and don't forget to check out our video on the strangest beauty practices from around the world.